The Aeroflot 593 plane crash had a lot of things going against it, be it the presence of two children in the cockpit, or the fact that the signal for autopilot not working was a blinker and had no sound. Let's see in detail what led to the death of 75 passengers in the Aeroflot 593 plane crash in 1994. What do you think was the angle at which the plane had tilted before the crash? What was the distance from the ground when it crashed? To know about such details of this gruesome and sad tragedy, keep watching. Have you imagined that you are on an overnight flight to the city of Hong Kong? The cabin is dark and most of the people are sleeping. This is a scenario most of us would have experienced, but also imagine that the plane started making some really strange turns. It even turned 90 degrees and started flying on its side. It then turned straight down and pressed you in the back with more than 4 Gs of force. This is an unimaginable amount of force, and something that most of us can't even fathom. Now think that even after making some recovery, you end up in an unreal and weightless free fall. It might make you think a child wildly played with the controls and made lousy decisions while on it. In this case, unfortunately, you would not be wrong, as we are talking about the fatal breakdown of the Aeroflot Flight 593 crash, which happened in March of 1994. This might seem like a far-fetched scenario where no one would ever let a child have control of the cockpit like this. But this is exactly what happened on that unfateful day. Let's look at it in more detail. The background. Aeroflot Flight 593 was en route from Moscow to Hong Kong, encompassing a routine flight plan. All 3 pilots would be rotating turns at the helm, and since this was a long flight, the group's captain would finish his shift and move to the cabin for some rest. The cockpit had 2 pilots. Yaroslav Kadrinsky and his co-pilot was First Officer Igor Piskaryov. The 2 pilots together had flown for 15,000 hours. They had 1,400 hours of experience flying the Airbus A310-300, which was a new and modern plane for Aeroflot. Most of their flying time was on Russian planes with different warning and operation systems. These small differences might have led to the bad crash instead of avoiding it. Besides the main pilot and co-pilot, a 3rd pilot was in the cockpit that night. His name was Vladimir Makarov, and he was another Aeroflot pilot who was traveling as a passenger. He was allowed to sit in an extra seat behind the pilots. New visitors in the cockpit. During the quiet part of the night flight, the captain let 2 visitors into the cockpit. This was a special moment for Captain Kadrinsky because his children were on the flight. They were going to have a holiday together in Hong Kong. The plane was flying by itself on autopilot, and not much was happening. His 15-year-old son, Eldar, and 13-year-old daughter, Yana, came into the cockpit at 12:40 a.m. The captain was happy to show his kids his job as a pilot, talked with them about what he does, and showed off a little. Command in the hand of Captain Kadrinsky's daughter, Yana. After a bit, Captain Kadrinsky got up and let his daughter Yana sit in his seat. When he stood up, he should have given control of the plane to the co-pilot, Igor Piskarov. But Piskarov was sitting far back, not ready to use the controls. If the captain had officially handed over control, Piskarov would have sat closer to the wheel. This seemed like a small mistake, but it could lead to big problems. The swap of seats seemed okay since the plane was on autopilot, letting Yana see things up close. She spent some time looking, asking questions, and touching the wheel. Her dad told her to turn the wheel left, which made the plane turn. It must have been exciting for her, but the captain actually helped by turning a knob to make the plane turn left. This is something pilots can do even when the plane is on autopilot. He turned the plane left by 15 degrees, tilting the wings. The autopilot was still managing the speed and altitude and could return to its set course. Pilots sometimes do this to avoid storms and then go back to autopilot. After trying the controls, Yana was ready to leave the seat. The captain warned her to be careful getting out because of the pedals and buttons near the seat. So far, everything in the cockpit seemed safe and under control, with everyone relaxed and enjoying a break from the usual routine. Command in the hand of Captain Kadrinsky's son, Eldar. At 12:51, it was Eldar's turn to sit in the captain's seat. He looked at all the buttons and screens. A few minutes later, at 12:54, he asked if he could turn the plane. The captain did the same thing he did with Yana. Makarov, the guest pilot, suggested showing the horizon on the main screen so Eldar could see the plane's angle. By 12:55, the autopilot was back in control, and everything seemed fine. Yana was talking to her dad about returning to her seat without waking up first-class passengers. While they were talking, Eldar asked a question that made all three pilots look at the instruments. They were all a bit confused because none of them had been fully watching the flight controls for some minutes. Figuring out what was happening took a few important seconds. When planes wait to land at an airport, they often circle in a pattern called a holding pattern. Flight in the holding pattern. The flight was supposed to follow a circling pattern like an oval around the airport. The line would curve in a U shape on the screen, showing the full turn in the programmed course. This pattern was the only reason the autopilot would make the circle, but they weren't near an airport, so the circling was confusing. Complete mayhem and final crash. In 20 seconds of discussion, the plane tilted more than 45 degrees. This was too much for the autopilot, which tried to fix the speed and altitude due to the tilt. Alarms about the altitude and bank angle started at 12:56, and the autopilot turned off. The plane was now leaning at 90 degrees and pointing down at 50 degrees, falling towards the ground at nearly 500 miles per hour. This created a force of 4.6 Gs, too strong for the structure of the plane. Piskarov, the co-pilot, couldn't reach the controls properly, and Eldar and Captain Kudrinsky couldn't switch seats. Piskarov tried to slow down and lift the nose but overdid it. Eldar accidentally pushed a pedal while moving, causing the plane to stall and spiral out of control. Passengers would have felt heavy G-forces and then weightlessness as the plane fell. By 12:57, Captain Kudrinsky was back in his seat, trying to regain control. But at less than 1,000 feet above ground, it was too late to do anything. The plane crashed at 12:58. The issue with autopilot and corrections. The plane itself had no issues and worked as it should. The problem was a feature unknown to the pilots. In Russian planes, an alarm sounds if any part of the autopilot turns off. The Airbus A310 only made a noise when the entire autopilot system was off, showing a light if only part of it was off. The captain didn't know that as Eldar turned the wheel, the plane was getting ready to turn off the autopilot for the roll controls. So, while the captain talked to Yana, Eldar kept turning the wheel a bit. In 30 seconds, the autopilot system assumed the turning action meant the pilot wanted to take over from the autopilot. The pilots didn't hear any alarm about the autopilot being interrupted, so they thought the autopilot was turning the plane for a valid reason and didn't question it. This misunderstanding lost the time they could have used to fix the situation. Meanwhile, the autopilot still controlled speed and altitude, causing unnoticed changes in the plane's angles, speed, and direction. All this happened quickly. Eldar asked to turn the control at 12:54. Just a minute later, he wondered why it turned by itself. The plane was tilting sharply for the next minute, and by 12:56, all the pilots realized the danger and tried to understand what was happening. In just 2 more minutes, at 12:58, the flight ended in a crash. It's hard to say what caused the crash. The lack of an audible warning when autopilot disengaged or the untrained teenager turning the wheel. This led to the tragic death of all 75 people on board. This was a wake-up call for Airbus, and they made a lot of changes after this, keeping in mind safety of the passengers. Mainly, Airbus updated its autopilot system and set limits on how much their planes can tilt. We just saw the details behind the malfunction of Aeroflot 593 and the eventual crash. Please comment on what detail was most shocking for you. Make sure to link our channel and subscribe. See you in the next video.